I'm delighted to be introducing Laura Wides-Munoz, who is here to talk about her new book, The Making of a Dream. The book begins with the DREAM Act, the Development Relief and Education for Alien Minors Act, which was a bipartisan effort designed to protect the more than 500,000 immigrants who were brought here as children without official documents. In 2012, they achieved the provisional protection of DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, but as we know, since Trump's election, their status has become precarious again. The Making of a Dream is the coming-of-age story of a movement, but it's also the coming-of-age story of several extraordinary activists who are dreamers themselves. The Kirkus Review calls this book a well-crafted, timely contribution to the immigrant debate. Author Laura Wides-Muñoz has worked as an immigration reporter for the Associated Press and is currently the Vice President for Special Projects at Fusion TV. Please join me in welcoming her to Politics and Prose.
Thank you so much to Politics and Prose for hosting me, and to everyone who came out on this rainy Super Bowl Sunday, This Is Us extravaganza afternoon. I know your time is valuable, so I very much appreciate it. This is a bit of This Is Your Life because I grew up in Washington, D.C., and there are so many friends and faces. Some of my elementary school and high school teachers are here, so I'm going to try to speak properly and not embarrass them. I covered immigration for close to a decade, and in 2010, I had been looking for a New Year's story because AP requires New Year's stories, and it's usually a dead news time. And I came across a press release that said that there was going to be some young people who were going to announce a march from Miami to Washington. And it sounded sort of interesting, and I went to this small little church in the middle of Little Haiti, and there were a group of young people. And as soon as I saw them on stage, I was captivated. They were enthusiastic, they were earnest, they had a little bit of swagger. They were basically your typical American teenagers. And Isabel Sosa-Rodriguez, who is here, and I'm so happy to have Isabel here with us today, was one of that group. And I watched them, and I wrote a story about their walk from Miami to Washington, which helped reinvigorate the immigrant rights movement in that decade. And I became fascinated by this group of young people. And I kept writing little pieces here and there, but by 2012, I felt so frustrated. I felt there were all these little stories, but nothing that really summed up what I began to see as one of the paramount movements of civil rights of our time. And I remember, actually, I was hanging out with my brother at Thanksgiving, and I said to him, you know, someone should write a book, a step back piece. And he looked at me and said, you're an immigration writer, you're a reporter, what the hell are you waiting for? So I took up his challenge, and one of the things I wanted to do was capture what it takes to make a movement, and the messiness inside the movement, the real people's lives. We root for superheroes, but ultimately we have empathy, and we see ourselves in humans. And I didn't want to sugarcoat people or the movement or what it takes to make change. And I also, as a journalist, what we most love are stories. And we love reading them, we love listening to them, we love writing them. And I wanted, ultimately, more than ever, for this to be just a good story. So I'm going to read some of the story. And afterward, I will take questions. This is a section of the book that starts, I think, in 2014. And it starts with Jerez Andrade, who's actually from Arlington, Virginia, and she couldn't be here today. She wanted to be. And her father was detained, and he was facing deportation, and she stepped up into the public limelight, risking her own safety to advocate for him. And ultimately he was allowed to stay in the U.S. You have to read to figure out what happened. But she had an internship at the AFL-CIO, which really changed her life. And one of the people actually in this book, Ana Avendaño, is sitting right here. And actually, I think this is in 2013. Hareth had a fellowship that summer at the AFL-CIO. The subway ride each morning from Arlington to McPherson Square subway stop, only blocks from the White House, transported her across a distance far greater than just the Potomac River. At the AFL-CIO, she was part of a much broader conversation about the future of America, something broader than she had ever discussed at United We Dream. On her long subway rides home from work, she racked her brain for people she'd forgotten to reach out to and the small neglected details about her father that she could add to the page to help his case. One afternoon, she began writing a few free-form lines in her notebook. The words began to shape themselves into thoughts, ideas she was too shy to share. It felt good to write. Hareth leaned back against the vinyl seats of the air-conditioned subway train, and for a few minutes, she felt free. At first, she kept her father's case quiet at work, some days not speaking to anyone else. But she confided in her supervisor, Ana Avendaño, the union's longtime immigration policy coordinator. And over time, her colleagues began to learn her story. The AFL-CIO takes care of its own had long been a union staple, but Ana put a different spin on the words. We take care of each other, she told Hareth. Don't give up. In September, a month before her father's hearing, the AFL-CIO offered Hareth a speaker spot at its national convention in Los Angeles. The union had promoted a pro-immigrant platform since 1999, but Hareth's speech came as the union announced it would for the first time include more low-wage non-unionized labor, even undocumented immigrants, in its organizing efforts. Now more than ever, the union sought to bridge the native immigrant labor divide as states across the country sought to copy a 2011 Wisconsin law trying to weaken union influence. President Obama was set to address the convention the same day as Hareth was scheduled to talk, and Hareth planned out in her head how she would wait for him off stage and beseech him to help save her father. Ana warned her how hard it would be just to grab the president. But she couldn't bring herself to dampen Hareth's determination. Hareth was almost giddy. If anyone could help, it would be the president. Then, at the last minute, Obama didn't come, and Hareth was crushed. The morning of her speech, she stepped outside to the parking lot for a few minutes to collect herself. What could she say to these men and women to convince them that her family's plight was worth their time? She called her friend Carolina Canizales, the National Deportation Defense Coordinator at United We Dream. Carolina had been cheerleading for Hareth for months throughout the year, and she offered advice. Tell them to stand up, she said. The physical act of moving, getting up out of a chair, literally standing up for something, was a long-standing organizing tactic. It would send a powerful message of solidarity to anyone watching and would create energy in the room, she promised. Suddenly, Hareth began to receive urgent texts. The schedule had been changed again. Her time was almost there. She needed to get back into the convention center. She made it to the stage just in time. Richard Trumka, the AFL-CIO president, gave a brief description of her family's case, and then Hareth stepped up. Hi, everybody, how you doing? She called out. The crowd murmured in response. She squared her shoulders, smoothed the black blazer she wore over her red and pink flowered dress, and looked out at a sea of gray-haired men, mostly pale, in suits and polo shirts. She exhaled. I know we can do better than that, she said, her nervous laugh echoing. Louder shouts. She pushed ahead. She reminded herself she had little left to lose. She told the crowd how she'd hoped to see the president and tell him about her father and how disappointed she was that that wasn't going to happen. Backstage, Ana and the schedulers looked at each other. Hareth was supposed to read a poem she'd written, not improvise. Hareth continued. Maybe, she said, since she wasn't going to speak to the president, they could all send a message to the president together. If you want to tell President Obama to stop my dad's deportation, please stand up, she said. Ana held her breath. She peeked out from the side of the stage. It was difficult to see the faces on the darkened convention floor. Unheard the shuffle of chairs and feet, first from the front, and then slowly, a wave moving toward the back, the cavernous room thundering with applause as hundreds of union members rose to their feet. Hareth clasped her hands behind her back and stepped up the broad, blue-carpeted steps of the convention stage. She turned to survey the crowd, a timid smile spreading across her face. Only then did she launch into the words she had first sketched out on those long metro rides, words that over time she had polished into a poem. America, we need to talk. And you can read the poem. It's it's a great poem. One of the things, before I open for questions, one of the things that I found surprising to me was, when I wrote this book, was not only how bipartisan the push for the DREAM Act was back in 2000, that you had Senator Dick Durbin, Orrin Hatch, working on this, and in fact, as many of you might recall, George W. Bush had actually put John Ashcroft and Colin Powell on the case of trying to figure out how to legalize millions of Mexicans who were in this country. And the first hearing for the DREAM Act was scheduled for September 12th of 2001. Clearly, it never happened. And I think we lose sight now, even today, even looking back to 2010, when the DREAM Act passed in the House and not the Senate, and people say now it could never pass in the House, how much change happens in our country? And one of the things I took away from this book is how possible change is, how many young people have been involved and pushed for this, and they didn't do it alone. They made a lot of mistakes. They had a lot of elders they learned from and a lot of elders they had to rebel against. They did get outside funding, but you cannot build a movement you cannot astroturf your way to change. And I hope that in writing this book, in addition to getting the lay of the land, or how we got to a place where a group of undocumented immigrants could shut down the entire government of the United States for a few days, it's also a place that people can come and think about how we can all be more engaged with our country and with creating a better democracy and making this place the America that we all want it to be. Questions? Thank you, journalist Mary Beth Sheridan.
So I was wondering if you could talk about how you chose the characters or encountered them, how you, when you realized that those were people who felt like the people who could really tell the story in the book.
Thank you. That was my biggest, probably, challenge throughout the book. How do you represent a movement that's really hundreds, if not thousands, of people, and who do you choose? And I saw Isabel and Felipe, Salsa Rodriguez, early on in Miami, and I knew those were people that I wanted to be in my book. And after that, I started doing some triangulation because I wanted people who represented geography. Marie Gonzalez is a young woman in the book. She was from Missouri. Hareth, who's not here, from Arlington. I wanted people from California. I wanted people who were so-called dream elders, who were coming of age when this movement started and the issue started back in 2000, and people who were just getting involved now, some still in high school. And I also, though, needed to have people that I could stay with for 5 years, that I found fascinating enough, and that I liked enough that I wanted to hang out with them for many, many years, and also people who would put up with me and constant questions and phone calls for 5 years. And not everyone wants to have their story told, and I think we vastly underestimate how much it takes to lay your life out, warts and all, for the bigger story. And sometimes people who are running organizations can't afford to do that. So I didn't always look for the people who were heading the organization. I looked for people who felt comfortable telling their story honestly.
Thank you for your interesting talk. So my question goes to, what is it that makes dreamers, well, first of all, telling stories, putting a face on a challenge is a brilliant way, I think, to help people empathize. So I'm really thankful that you wrote this book to try to put a human face on it. So this country was obviously made up by immigrants, and it's my personal opinion that we need immigration to support old people like me. When I get older, we need people coming into the job market. So what is it that makes these dreamers so different from other immigrants? It seems like politically we're being forced to choose. If we do something nice for the dreamers, we have to give up something on the other side. It's kind of put us in a bind, hasn't it?
Great question, and I think that's something that has come up a lot. And you know, honestly, the definition of a so-called dreamer, I mean, Trump the other day said we're all dreamers, and in some ways that was a little bit of the all lives matter response, because yes, all lives matter, but in the past we have not recognized always that Black lives matter. And the same thing can be said about dreamers. We are all dreamers, but these individuals have not been recognized for their humanity. But you're right, there is sort of this false distinction. These people are worthy and no one else is. And one of the characters in my book came 2 months after he turned 16. He was never eligible for the DREAM Act. He couldn't afford to go to college. And he questions, why is my life, I'm working, he does HIV prevention. He's training now to be a nurse's assistant. Why is my life and my contribution to the US less worthy than someone who got to go to college or got a scholarship to Harvard? So I agree it's a false distinction, and beyond that, one of the things this book talks about is how painful it has been for so many young undocumented immigrants to be pitted against their parents. And this isn't something new. Marie Gonzalez, one of the characters early on, talks about this visceral nausea she feels when she's called to stand up in front of Capitol and say, I came here through no fault of my own, basically throwing her parents under the bus. There is a broader, in my opinion, there is a broader conversation to be had about immigration reform that is urgent and is needed. But there is also something that can be done now, and we have kicked the can down the road for a very long time, and so it's time to take action. And the last thing I will just say is that there are going to have to be compromises made, and many of the people in my book do not agree necessarily that they want to compromise. But that is how we get legislation done in this country. And the question is where we're going to land within that.
Since there's nobody else at the mic, I'll ask another question. So could you make a prediction? What do you think will happen?
Well, as a journalist, I feel a profound nausea in trying to do that. But I would say I am cautiously optimistic that something will happen because, as I've laid out in the book, there has been a cultural change. You know, when you get Brie Larson and, you know, P. Diddy and, you know, you have Hollywood shows that are depicting undocumented immigrants in their real lives, there's a cultural shift. And if you look at the polls, you know, 70 to 80% want to legalize many of these young undocumented immigrants. A small but still majority want citizenship. So that's happened. And now the politicians here in this beautiful city have to catch up with what the country wants.
Congratulations on the book. I look forward to reading it. You started to discuss this a little bit, but I'd be interested to know, who did the Dreamers see as their allies? You know, no movement could really exist in isolation. So was it with the faith community, you know, the African American community, the Latino community? And then were there allies that people expected to have, and in the end they didn't have, and that they were disappointed by?
So yes to the second question. I think it's complicated because I think, as I said in the beginning, movements are messy, and different people sought different allies. So there was one group, Gabby Pacheco, Harith Andrade, who's in this book, who had an organization called the Bridge Project, and they really sought to lobby and work with Republicans in Congress There have been some who have worked with evangelical groups and really bridged the religion sector. Isabel and Felipe and the other walkers, they often would were given room and board when they were on their walk by religious institutions. At the same time, there were groups, even I think the AFL-CIO at times, that was not comfortable promoting this smaller group and really wanted all or nothing. And Anna's shaking her head so she can speak. But there were different organizations, veteran organizations, that felt that just promoting this smaller group would be selling out the larger 11 million undocumented immigrants, who would then not be as an attractive group to legalize. And so early on there was tension there. And then I would also point out that the LGBTQ movement was incredibly influential, both because it's sort of the most current civil rights movement that was happening at the same time in 2010, the same day the vote that the Dreamers lost. They reversed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell law that would have basically was a tool to discriminate against gay and lesbians and in the military. And so that was a group that was doing a lot of organizing at the same time, and it would be honest, it was a more well-funded organization, en masse. And so there was a lot of cross-pollination. There were also a lot of LGBTQ leaders within the youth immigrant rights movement, who were influenced by and influencing the LGBTQ movement.
I just greatly admire what you've done and look forward to reading your book. I guess that probably just about everybody in this room, since we're old, wizened Washingtonians in one way or another, know that lobbying and this kind of action, catching media attention and all, needs to go hand in hand later or sooner with political action. And I guess I'm wondering if you could speak to some degree about whether that is a part of what people are doing, the people that you followed, and whether there's a strategy for 2018.
Well, I am not an activist. I am a journalist, so I don't know the strategy for all of the activists and organizers. Probably a good thing. Yes, there certainly is, and I think, Isabel, you said this, that or maybe it was Felipe who said this in Miami, that change happens because ultimately people do take to the streets. And one of the things that's in my book is how people who are on the outside, pressuring more on the extremes, helped, just as during the 1960s, helped lawmakers focus and negotiate with people who are in Washington, maybe going through more traditional channels. I think there are going to be many, many different strategies that are going to continue to happen. I wouldn't predict them. I hope they surprise us, and I bet they will.
Thank you.
We all are very proud of what you've done and think the book is fantastic. But one of the questions raised another question for me, which is, let's assume that and hope that we're successful and that that something is passed that permits Dreamers to stay. Do you expect the Dreamers then to come out in support, for example, of those who are threatened with deportation under TPS, and particularly for some of those who otherwise would find their families split up if the parents are deported and the kids who have been born in the U.S. Either have the choice of going back to Salvador or staying? But do you think Dreamers are going to take an active role in that?
Yes, and just for everyone in the room, TPS is temporary protected status that many people from war-torn countries or countries that have faced incredible natural disasters were given. It was never supposed to be permanent, but people have now been here under this status for 10, 20 years, and it's now being revoked. And obviously, I don't want to revisit some of the recent comments in reference to countries that have received this, but there are already groups, I know in Miami, that the undocumented youth have been very active on TPS, and working with groups UndocuBlack, which is undocumented youth who are Black and Caribbean and from African countries experiencing that. There's been a lot of crossover into the other question about different groups working together. I do think there will be. I don't think they are going to get their ticket and forget everyone else. I think they will be in a better place to advocate for their families if they aren't worried about being, having their home raided at night because they spoke out on the evening news.
Hi.
This is my high school English teacher, everybody. She was amazing.
She was a joy to teach.
Sorry, I had to say that.
And a wonderful babysitter. The number of dreamers has been debated, and I gather that Trump has expanded in some ways the scope of it, of the number. But I'm also curious and concerned about why anybody in this day and age would come forward, given how precarious things are. And on the second part of that is that are there organizations that can protect the identities of people who identify themselves as dreamers and support them that will not be subject to, are less likely to be subject to government intrusion?
I'm not sure if, okay, so to unpack that question.
Okay, yes.
The first part was, why would anyone come forward?
Right now in this climate.
I mean, I watched Selma the other night, and I don't want to, movements are different, civil rights violations are different. I don't want to compare things, but you could ask the same thing then. Why did young people put their lives on the line? Because they were desperate. They felt like they had no other choice. They felt dehumanized.
Why would they? Are they continuing to come
Right, so they
forward?
are continuing, but people are scared. People are very scared, and I think that gets a lot to the mental health situation. So we need more people providing mental health, because when you worry that every night, you or your parents could be taken away, obviously it's very hard to focus in school, let alone at work and in communities. There are lots of groups helping, and I could start listing them, but I would recommend that you talk to Isabel and to Anna afterwards if you're at all interested in providing help. I know they're looking for legal volunteers and people to defend, people to fill out information, and these two are here, and I hate to put you guys on the spot, but they're the folks who would know where to send you.
Hey, Laura. I look forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
I'd love to hear you mentioned that there was some outside funding for the movement. I'd love to hear your observations about the role of funding. How hard was it for them to get funding? Was it helpful? Did it undermine their efforts in any way? What were your thoughts on that as you covered
One
the
of the
story?
things I found very fascinating, having sort of covered this issue from the outside, but once I started digging in, was that early on, there were a few philanthropists who saw, especially after 9/11, there were a lot of people who were being deported because they were being associated with terrorism, and they had no protections and all of that. So there were a group that started working on that. There was also groups that were working with undocumented immigrants, and clearly it wasn't like the union halls or even churches in the South. There was no place you could meet because you're undocumented, and a group of people who get together undocumented is kind of a red flag. So there was a recognition on the part of some very forward-thinking philanthropists that we need to support basically space and organizers, that we need to support space and basic training. And they started to seed, but one of the problems is the very big foundations that had the money, they don't give little grants that small nonprofits can handle. They're used to dumping millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. So there were groups, and I talk about them in the book, that started to funnel some of those bigger grants to smaller organizations across the country who could then seed that money to even smaller groups. So in Miami, you had the Florida Immigrant Advocacy Center, which had done legal work and a lot of sort of just basic casework and some advocacy, and then they were able from there to seed the Florida Immigrant Coalition, which did much more advocacy and then organizing, and they did the Students Working for Equal Rights, which Isabel was a part of, which was a student group, and so there you go down the line. So it was incredibly helpful and essential, and I think there's sort of a myth that young activists and organizers spring out of Zeus's head like Athena, fully formed, and that's not true. They need that training. They need philanthropists who are willing to take a risk. And also I would say that the philanthropists who funded many different parts of the movement, that was also very important, because you can't just fund one group and then have that sort of unnaturally dominate. And all these groups working together is what has created change. So seeing the need for diversity, which sometimes means you have people arguing, and that's okay too, and that's part of it. There has been more money. Post-2010, once these activists showed that they could get a bill to the floor and almost get it passed, money did start coming in straight from groups like the Ford Foundation and others that really did start giving much more money. And, you know, it takes money to get buses to Washington. It takes money to do anything. But I think it's easy to say, oh, well, they had money now. You know, that's how they did it. This isn't about money. They need money to do it, but it wouldn't happen if these young people weren't willing to do things that many of us would think twice about doing. Yes, please.
Yeah, well, and also just the fact that it took a lot of time to even get any money. There was a lot of time in the building of the immigrant youth movement that there wasn't any financial support. Even to this day, I mean, aside from like United We Dream, that is very dedicated to building the capacity and leadership development of youth across this country, like youth organizing is very poorly funded across the nation, and there's a funders collaborative on youth organizing that's constantly struggling to create seed grants for all kinds of groups across the nation in different sectors. So yeah, I mean, I think there were individuals who had kind of discretionary funds in the beginning that would like take little bits apart, and we tried to stretch those dollars as far as we could, and also just ask people to believe in us and make sacrifices, and you know, community coming together to get us to the next step. But yeah, I mean, there were many years that the money wasn't there, and I think to this point that there's still a need for more support to keep building and keep sustaining and keep developing the next generation of leaders.
Thank you. Yes, what he said. I guess I would just leave you, if you're wondering how we got here, why this is on the nightly news every day, and you want a good read, this is a walk through this history, and this is a story really about all of us.